Amara Bennett sat quietly in seat 1A. Then a white woman appeared in the aisle, staring down at her with a look that made it clear she didn't belong. Within minutes, the demands started. Move to the back. Make room for someone who deserved it more. When Amara refused, the crew caved under pressure. Crying and alone in economy, she made a single call mid-flight to the one person who would never let injustice stand. They thought they could get away with it. They thought no one important would care. But this time, they underestimated who was watching and what was coming. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Amara Bennett sat tucked into seat 1A, her small frame dwarfed by the wide leather cushions and gleaming armrests that marked the difference between ordinary and extraordinary. She ran her hand slowly along the polished surface of the fold-out table, feeling the cool smoothness beneath her fingers, marveling at how different everything seemed up here, where the air smelled faintly of citrus and leather rather than coffee and stale luggage. First class was another world entirely, and for the first time, she was not peeking at it through a curtain, but living it, even if her sneakers barely brushed the thick carpet when she swung her legs. The plane rumbled lightly beneath her, taxiing across the sun-warmed tarmac. She pressed her forehead gently against the oval window, her breath fogging a small patch of glass as she watched service trucks and flashing lights dart across the concrete like ants in a hive. Somewhere deep in the belly of the airport, her suitcase rumbled along a conveyor belt, heading toward the same destination as her. She smiled to herself, thinking how proud her father would be when she told him how grown-up she felt, handling her first solo flight with the kind of cool confidence he always said would take her farther than anything else. The seatbelt clicked snugly around her waist, the weight of it making her feel anchored, important somehow. She adjusted the small pink backpack nestled at her feet, pulling out the neatly folded note her father had tucked inside that morning. His handwriting, strong and even, sprawled across the lined paper. "Proud of you, Princess. Remember who you are. You deserve every good thing." She read it twice, the words sinking into her chest and warming her like sunlight. Folding it carefully, she tucked it back into the outer pocket of her bag, locking a piece of him inside to carry with her. The flight attendants moved briskly up and down the aisle, their smiles bright but mechanical, hands fluttering over seatbelts and life vests as they recited instructions in calm, practiced voices. Amara followed along obediently, though she had already watched the safety video twice that morning in her excitement. Around her, passengers in crisp suits and designer sweaters adjusted their watches, tapped at tablets, and murmured into sleek earbuds. A few glanced her way. A child alone, so young, so out of place in the luxury of seat 1A, but most looked past her, their attention already retreating into their own insulated worlds. Still, Amara could feel it, an invisible line that had drawn itself the moment she sat down. It was not outright hostility, not yet, but a kind of questioning, a subtle pressure that weighed heavier the longer she sat there in her brightly colored jacket and sneakers. She straightened her posture, smoothed her hair with the flat of her palm, and lifted her chin the way her mother always told her to do when she felt eyes on her. She belonged here. She had earned this place, even if it was gifted to her, because it was a gift born of love, not charity, and she refused to shrink beneath the smallness of someone else's gaze. From 2 rows behind her, a woman's voice floated forward, low but sharp enough to slice through the polite murmur of the cabin. "Probably an upgrade mistake," the woman said to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. "They must have bumped her up by accident." A soft laugh answered her, muffled behind a napkin or a hand, but the meaning was unmistakable. Amara stiffened, the words lodging deep beneath her skin, burning there. She stared straight ahead, willing herself not to turn around, not to show that she had heard, not to give them the satisfaction. The engines roared to life beneath her feet, a low, powerful hum that grew and grew until the plane quivered and surged forward. Amara gripped the armrests lightly, heart racing in rhythm with the building speed, and then, weightlessness, the momentary thrill of lifting off the ground. She laughed under her breath, eyes wide as the earth tilted away and the clouds opened above, welcoming her into the sky. When the seatbelt sign chimed off and the cabin settled into its cruising altitude, Amara relaxed into the soft cushions, pulling out a slim paperback she had tucked into the side pocket earlier. She let herself exhale fully for the first time, feeling, finally, that she could enjoy this. She was here. She had made it. She was part of the world her father had always told her she deserved to move through without apology. A gentle clink of silverware caught her attention. She glanced up and saw the attendants beginning to prepare the first-class meal service, moving with the smooth choreography of professionals who had done this 1,000 times before. Amara smiled politely as one of them passed by, receiving a nod in return, and turned back to her book, determined to savor every second of this flight, every bit of this small but meaningful triumph. She was so focused on the printed words that she almost missed it at first, the slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from the cabin just behind her. She heard the whisper of movement, the slight shift of air, and when she glanced up, she caught the figure of a woman in a crisp white blouse and designer jeans stepping purposefully toward the front of the plane. The woman's sharp features were set into a thin, determined line, her eyes locked onto something, or someone, with a focus that made Amara's stomach tighten without fully understanding why. The woman paused near the flight attendant's station, murmured something with a tight smile, then turned her head, and her gaze landed squarely on Amara. For a moment, neither of them moved. The hum of the engines filled the space between them, steady and low, but to Amara, it felt as if the world had tilted slightly, a quiet warning rippling just beneath the surface of her excitement. The woman adjusted her purse strap, squared her shoulders, and began walking again, straight toward seat 1A. The woman stopped a few feet from Amara's seat, her smile brittle at the edges, the kind of expression that looked polite if you glanced too quickly, but turned sharp and cold the moment you really looked. She leaned down slightly, resting one manicured hand against the seat back in front of Amara, lowering her voice just enough to make it seem like a private conversation, while keeping it loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Sweetheart," she said, her tone dripping with practiced condescension, "I think you're in the wrong seat. First class is for ticketed passengers only." Amara blinked up at her, stunned not by the words themselves, but by the way the woman said them. Not as a question, not with any real concern, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided she was right. Heat rose quickly in Amara's face, and she gripped the armrest lightly, grounding herself the way her father had taught her to do whenever she felt that first flash of anger or fear. "I'm in the right seat," Amara said, forcing her voice to stay calm even as her stomach twisted. "1A. It's on my ticket." The woman's smile thinned even further, her lips almost disappearing into a tight, pale line. She straightened slowly, glanced toward the nearby flight attendant, a young man with neatly combed hair, who had been pretending not to notice but now shifted uncomfortably under her stare, and turned her attention back to Amara with a flicker of something sharper flashing across her face. "My daughter is back in economy," the woman said, her voice louder now, drawing glances from nearby rows. "She's supposed to be sitting with me. I need you to move so she can take your seat." Amara stared at her, heart hammering, the absurdity of it struggling to find a place in her mind. She opened her mouth but only managed a quiet, confused, "Why?" At first, the single word slipping out before she could stop it. "Because," the woman said with a clipped laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all, "this isn't the place for unaccompanied minors." She tacked the words on with exaggerated patience, as if explaining something simple to someone too slow to grasp it. "And certainly, Not when families need to be together. Amara's hands balled tightly into fists in her lap. She could hear the subtle shift of the cabin again, the pull of attention, the way the world inside the plane seemed to tilt against her. Subtle, but relentless. She glanced at the flight attendant for support, but his nervous glance at the woman told her everything she needed to know. "I'm sitting where I'm supposed to be," Amara said louder, more firmly this time, her voice shaking slightly but clear. "My dad booked this seat for me. I have a boarding pass." The woman's eyebrows lifted in a performance of disbelief so exaggerated it almost looked theatrical. She turned slightly toward the surrounding passengers, as if inviting them to join in her outrage. "This is ridiculous," she said, half to Amara and half to the growing audience. "First-class seats aren't for children flying alone, especially when someone paid for 2 seats together." "I'm sure she's just confused." Amara shook her head firmly. "No, I'm not confused. This is my seat." The flight attendant finally edged closer, his hands wringing together, his voice wobbling under the tension. "Maybe we can find a solution," he offered weakly, already glancing toward the back of the plane as if planning her removal. "No," Amara said, louder now, her chest burning. "I'm not moving. My dad bought this seat. I'm not going anywhere." Passengers around them shifted again, some staring openly now, others pretending to read magazines or fiddle with their phones. But all of them tuned into the conflict. A few exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others dismissive. But no one spoke up. No one challenged the woman who loomed over a child fighting for the seat she had every right to claim. The woman's smile sharpened, her patience wearing thin. "Listen, honey," she said, leaning closer, voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "You can either move now, or you can make this very uncomfortable for yourself." Amara recoiled slightly, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She opened her mouth to argue again, to insist, to fight harder. But before she could find the words, another attendant, older and wearing a seniority pin, arrived, her posture already stiff with impatience. "What's the problem?" the woman snapped briskly. The story was quickly, sloppily explained. And before Amara could even show her ticket, before she could defend herself one more time, the older attendant's decision came down like a hammer. "Miss, if you could just move back to coach for now," she said, her voice clipped and final, full of the kind of authority that didn't invite argument. "We'll sort it out later. Thank you for cooperating." Amara gripped the armrests so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You're not even looking at my ticket," she said, her voice rising in disbelief, frustration and humiliation surging together into something that shook the edge of her composure. "I didn't do anything wrong. This is my seat." The attendant frowned, clearly seeing Amara's refusal not as a defense of her rights, but as a disturbance to be handled quickly and quietly. Passengers continued to watch, silent, complicit, their gazes pricking like tiny needles against Amara's skin. "We need you to move," the attendant said again, colder now, her patience evaporating. "Or we'll have to involve the captain." For a second longer, Amara stayed frozen, battling the overwhelming urge to stay planted where she was, to defy them all and refuse to be pushed out. Her chest heaved with the effort of it, her whole body trembling. And then, slowly, heavily, the reality of her situation crushed down around her. She was 13 years old, alone, surrounded by strangers who had already decided she didn't belong. Without a word, she reached for her backpack, blinking furiously against the tears that blurred her vision, and stood up, the seat creaking softly as she left it behind. She felt the weight of 100 eyes following her as she shuffled down the narrow aisle, her head high even as every step felt heavier than the last. Behind her, the woman slid easily into seat 1A, smiling warmly at her daughter, who trailed in behind her, settling into the luxury stolen from a girl too young to fight the entire plane alone. And somewhere deep in Amara's chest, a cold, heavy knot formed, tighter and heavier with every step she took away from the place that had been rightfully hers. Amara slumped into the cramped economy seat near the back of the plane, squeezing herself against the window as if trying to disappear into it. The space felt smaller somehow, the air heavier, thicker, every breath scraping painfully at her chest. She kept her head turned sharply toward the window, blinking hard, fighting the tears that welled and spilled faster than she could catch them. She pressed the sleeve of her jacket to her face, trying to wipe them away before anyone could see. But it was no use. The humiliation clung to her, hot and suffocating, and the more she tried to force it down, the harder it pushed back, building until her shoulders trembled against her will. The dull murmur of conversation floated around her, passengers chatting, laughing, the clink of drink carts moving lazily through the aisle, but none of it seemed real. None of it seemed connected to her anymore. She was adrift, cut loose from the place she was supposed to be, forced into this tiny seat with nothing but her anger and shame pressing against her ribs like a hand she couldn't push away. A soft voice cut through the haze, gentle and careful, the way someone might approach a wounded animal. "Hey, sweetheart. You okay?" Amara flinched slightly, wiping at her face again before daring to turn. Beside her, across the aisle, sat an older woman, maybe in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a soft gray sweater pulled snug around her shoulders. Her expression was open, full of genuine concern, not the detached curiosity that so many others had worn like armor earlier. Amara tried to nod, to pretend she was fine, but her throat closed up again, and the tears she had tried so hard to contain spilled over, hot and unstoppable. The woman leaned closer, lowering her voice further so only Amara could hear. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" For a long moment, Amara hesitated, clutching the strap of her backpack so tightly her fingers ached. She didn't want to relive it, didn't want to say the words out loud and make them more real than they already were. But something in the woman's voice, the steady, patient way she waited, made it impossible to hold it all inside. "They made me move," Amara whispered hoarsely, the words barely more than a breath. "I had a seat up there. My dad bought it for me. They said it wasn't for someone like me." The woman's face darkened, her mouth pressing into a thin, angry line, not directed at Amara, but at something far larger and uglier. She nodded slowly, letting the anger flash through her before smoothing it away, offering Amara only calm. "I'm so sorry, baby," she said quietly. "That's not right. That's not right at all." Amara dropped her gaze back to her lap, blinking hard, feeling the burn of shame twist tighter in her chest, despite the kindness. She didn't know what she had expected. Maybe for someone to stand up for her. Maybe for the world to notice that something was wrong, but it hadn't happened. And now she was here, crumpled and alone in a seat that felt like a punishment. The woman hesitated, then leaned in a little closer, her voice even softer. "Do you have someone you can call? Your parents, maybe? Someone who can help?" Amara sniffled, fumbling through the pocket of her backpack until her fingers brushed her phone. She pulled it out, hesitating, the screen blurring with tears she wiped away with the sleeve of her jacket. "My dad," she said thickly. He's probably busy. He works a lot." The woman smiled gently, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I bet he'll want to hear from you right now, and something tells me he'll know exactly what to do." Amara stared at the phone in her hand for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. She could hear her father's voice in her mind, steady and warm, telling her that she was never alone. Not really. Not as long as she remembered who she was. She drew a shaky breath, squared her shoulders slightly, and unlocked the phone, pulling up his number. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the call button, the ringtone pulsing against her ear like a lifeline stretched across the distance. The woman across the aisle gave her a small, encouraging nod, mouthing, "You've got this." Amara closed her eyes for a second, letting the sound of the ringing wash over her, bracing herself for the moment her father's voice would come through and remind her that no matter how small they tried to make her feel, she had every right to stand tall. The call clicked through, and her father's voice answered, calm and steady, just as she had imagined. "Hey, princess," he said warmly. "Everything okay?" The knot in her chest broke open then, the words tumbling out in a rush. The story of everything that had happened. The anger, the shame, the helplessness she had swallowed until now, spilling into the spaces between her sobs. And as she spoke, she could feel something shifting. Not in the plane, not in the passengers around her, but inside herself. A small, fierce spark reigniting, fed by the quiet strength in her father's voice, and the simple truth that she was not alone, and she was not powerless, not anymore. Victor listened without interrupting, his voice low and steady whenever Amara faltered, offering quiet encouragement that wrapped around her like a shield against the rawness of what she was reliving. He let her pour out everything, the way the woman had spoken to her, the way the flight attendants had turned away, the way every glance had felt like a shove toward the back of the plane. He absorbed it all with a stillness that came from years of learning when to move and when to wait, when to speak and when to listen. And now, as his daughter's voice broke again into muffled sobs, he knew it was time to act. "Princess," he said gently, the way he always did when he needed her to listen closely, "I need you to do something for me. All right?" Amara nodded, even though he couldn't see her, clutching the phone tighter against her ear, as if afraid that letting go would leave her adrift again. "I need you to breathe," he said softly. "In through your nose, slow and deep. Hold it, let it out." Again. She obeyed, shakily at first, but steadier with the second breath, the third. The burning behind her eyes eased slightly, the tightness in her chest loosening just enough for her to lift her head and sit a little straighter in the narrow seat. "Good girl," Victor murmured, pride threading through his voice like a warm undercurrent. "Now listen, you did nothing wrong. You hear me? Nothing. And I'm going to fix this. You just stay calm for me. Can you do that?" "Yes, Daddy," she whispered, her voice small but determined. "Good," he said again, and something in the tone of that word, the firm finality of it, told her that whatever was about to happen was already bigger than anything she could see from her tiny window seat at the back of the plane. Victor shifted his phone slightly, putting her on speaker as he moved smoothly through his office, the leather soles of his shoes soundless against the polished floor. Outside his wide glass windows, the city skyline gleamed under the midday sun, but his focus was absolute, narrowed down to one thing: his daughter, sitting alone and wronged 6 miles above the ground. He pressed a single button on his office landline, the call instantly routing to his executive assistant, Marcy, who answered before the second ring. "Yes, sir? I need a full flight manifest for Flight 473, he said, his voice calm but edged with a precision that made Marcy immediately sit up straighter at her desk. "Now! I also want the names of the flight crew, the supervisor on board, and the passengers seated in rows 1 through 3. "Understood," Marcy said crisply. "It'll be in your inbox in 2 minutes." He didn't wait for confirmation. His mind was already moving, calculating, strategizing. He dialed a second line, internal operations this time, reaching the director of in-flight services directly. "This is Victor Bennett," he said, skipping the usual pleasantries. "I need a message relayed to the captain of Flight 473 immediately. No interventions without executive review. All staff interactions from this point forward are to be logged. Do you understand?" There was a slight hesitation on the other end, the shock of realizing exactly who was calling, and then a rush of agreement, the clatter of someone scrambling to follow orders they knew better than to question. Victor ended the call without another word, switching back to his cell where Amara waited quietly, the faint sound of the airplane humming behind her. "Still with me, princess?" he asked, his voice softening again. "Yes," she said, a little stronger now. "Good. Now listen. You just stay in your seat. Stay calm. Keep your head up. Nothing else is going to happen until we land. And when we do, I'll be there." A tiny breath hitched in her throat, not a sob this time, but something lighter, almost a laugh choked off by the enormity of relief. The kind of laugh that came when the weight of the world had been pressing down so hard you forgot what it felt like to breathe without pain. "Okay," she whispered, the smallest thread of hope winding through the word. He smiled slightly, even though she couldn't see him, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes because his mind was already turning again, already charting the next moves, already preparing to meet the people who had dared to treat his daughter like she was less than what she was. "I'll see you soon," he said, his voice a promise wrapped in steel. "Okay," she said again, clutching the phone to her chest for a moment after the call ended, drawing strength from the steady thrum of her father's confidence as if it were something she could hold in her hands. Across the aisle, the older woman who had urged her to call gave her a small, approving nod, her eyes warm with something that looked a lot like pride. And for the first time since the beginning of this awful, spiraling mess, Amara felt the smallest flicker of something fierce and solid spark back to life inside her. Something that told her this wasn't over, and that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't going to end the way they thought it would. The minutes after the call stretched long and heavy, the low hum of the engines blending into the buzz of conversation that ebbed and flowed around Amara without touching her. She sat stiffly, wiping at her cheeks with trembling fingers, breathing slowly the way her father had taught her, trying to fold herself into something small and invisible, while her emotions still simmered beneath the surface, raw and close to the skin. Across the aisle, the older woman kept a quiet, watchful presence, offering a kind of steady companionship without crowding Amara's grief, as if she understood that sometimes the greatest kindness was simply being there without asking for anything in return. For a while, that was enough. The steadiness, the knowledge that her father was moving mountains she could not yet see, but the peace was short-lived. A shadow fell across Amara's row, and when she looked up, she saw the senior flight attendant standing over her, arms folded tightly across her chest, her mouth pinched in a tight, disapproving line. Her uniform, once polished and crisp, now seemed stiff and cold, an extension of the authority she wore like armor. "You need to calm down, young lady," the woman said sharply, her voice low enough to pretend at privacy, but edged with enough steel that it cut clean through the hum of the cabin. "Your crying is making other passengers uncomfortable." The words hit Amara harder than she could have prepared for. A fresh slap of humiliation that sent a hot rush of anger rising beneath her skin. She opened her mouth, struggling to find something, anything, to say in response. But before she could speak, the woman across the aisle leaned forward, her voice slicing through the tension like a knife. "Excuse me," the older woman said, her tone deceptively mild, the kind that warned of a deeper, coiled anger just beneath the surface. "She's a child who was mistreated by your staff. Maybe you should worry a little more about what caused her to cry, and a little less about the fact that people are being made uncomfortable by the sight of a little girl in distress." The flight attendant blinked, thrown off by the unexpected resistance. She straightened slightly, lifting her chin with the brittle authority of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice," she said sharply. "We're trying to maintain a peaceful environment." The older woman let out a soft, incredulous laugh, not loud, but sharp enough that several nearby passengers turned to look. "Peaceful?" she repeated, her voice cool and biting. "You allowed a paying passenger to be bullied out of her seat by another customer. And now you want to lecture a child about disturbing the peace? How dare you?" The attendant flushed, a quick, ugly red blooming across her cheeks, and for a brief moment she looked as if she might argue, might push back harder, but something in the older woman's gaze stopped her. Something unflinching, something that said, "Try it," and promised it would not end the way she wanted. "I suggest you walk away," the older woman said quietly, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm, "before you make an even bigger mistake than you already have." The flight attendant hesitated, clearly weighing her options, the attention of too many passengers now fixed on the confrontation, their curiosity sharpened into judgment. With a stiff nod, she turned on her heel and marched away, her back rigid, her steps clipped and angry. Amara sat frozen for a moment, still stunned by how quickly the tide had shifted, how the woman who had sat silently beside her had become a shield against the storm she had been too small to fight off alone. She turned toward her, blinking back the fresh sting in her eyes, not from shame this time, but from the overwhelming rush of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The older woman softened, her sternness melting into a small, warm smile. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart," she said gently. "You deserve to be treated with respect, and you don't owe anyone your silence to make them comfortable." Amara nodded slowly, letting the words settle into the raw, tender places the last hour had torn open inside her. She tucked them away, folding them carefully next to her father's words. Another layer of armor she hadn't known she needed until today. She sat back in her seat, straightening slightly, feeling the weight on her chest loosen just a little more. She wasn't whole yet, not fully, but she was no longer broken in the same way. The pieces were shifting, knitting themselves back together around something harder, stronger, something that remembered everything and promised not to forget. Somewhere ahead of them, first class continued in its quiet luxury, untouched by the storm brewing at the back of the plane. Linda Calloway laughed lightly at something her daughter said, sipping champagne as if nothing had happened, as if Amara's tears and humiliation were nothing more than a temporary inconvenience best forgotten before the next course was served. But Amara knew better now. She knew it wasn't over. She knew the real storm was waiting at the gate, standing tall in a tailored suit with fire in his heart, and her name written across his every intention. And when the wheels touched down and the doors opened, the reckoning would begin. The plane droned steadily onward, carving its invisible path through the sky. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. It was subtle at first, a stiffness in the flight attendants' movements, the way their smiles slipped a fraction too quickly, the way their eyes darted toward the cabin phone whenever it rang. The illusion of normalcy strained at the seams, stretched thin by the quiet, invisible pressure building behind the scenes. In the back row of economy, Amara sat still and watchful, no longer crying, her face set in careful neutrality as she clutched her phone in her lap. The screen still lit with the last message from her father. "Landing soon. Stay strong, princess. I'm here." She didn't know exactly what he had done or how far his reach would stretch before the wheels even touched down, but she trusted him the way she trusted the sky to hold the plane aloft. Somewhere up there, above all the polished uniforms and false smiles, above the unspoken rules about who belonged where, her father was moving quietly and surely, pulling levers she couldn't even see yet. Near the front of the plane, the senior flight attendant, the one who had scolded her for crying, huddled briefly with a second attendant by the service galley, their heads bent low, voices tense but hurried. Amara couldn't hear the words, but she saw the way their bodies angled sharply inward, the way the second attendant's eyes widened slightly before darting back toward the economy cabin. Another flight attendant passed through the aisles more briskly now, checking seat belts and tray tables, his polite murmurings clipped and distracted. A soft crackle of the cabin phone interrupted the low buzz of conversation, and this time, when the attendant answered, his hand tightened slightly around the handset, his shoulders stiffening before he hastily replaced it and disappeared into the forward galley. Passengers began to notice the tension too. Conversations lowered, heads tilted subtly toward the aisles, the normal cocoon of disinterest thinning into something more curious, more alert. They didn't know what was happening yet, but they could feel it. A shift in the air, a heaviness that hung just beneath the hum of the engines. Linda Calloway, oblivious or willfully ignorant, reclined comfortably in seat 1A, her voice carrying lightly over the first-class cabin as she chatted with her daughter. Her laughter, sharp and bright, felt jarring against the growing tightness around her, like the clang of silverware dropped in a silent church. A few rows back, another passenger glanced up from his tablet, frowning faintly at the sudden increase in cabin crew movement, the whispered conferences, the tightened faces. People who had once looked toward Amara with vague disinterest now shifted uneasily in their seats, casting occasional glances back toward the economy section, as if searching for the source of the disturbance they could feel, but not name. Amara watched it all through lowered lashes, her heart a slow, steady drumbeat in her chest. She felt the power of it building around her. Not loud, not explosive, but sure and deliberate, like a tide pulling back before a wave. She knew instinctively that her father's hands were on the levers now, not to create a scene, but to make sure that when the truth came crashing down, it would leave no room for denial or escape. Somewhere near the cockpit, the captain himself had been briefed. A quiet conversation, a clipped acknowledgement. And now he sat with his jaw set and his eyes hard, reviewing the passenger manifest with a growing sense of dread. He understood the gravity of the situation better than anyone else on board, understood the consequences waiting on the ground if things were not handled exactly right. The attendants moved faster now, preparing the cabin for landing, but their usual easy professionalism had frayed, their hands fumbling slightly with seatbelt checks and trash collection. The cheerful pretense of service had vanished, replaced with something raw and mechanical, a race against the inevitable. As the plane began its slow descent, the seatbelt signs flickering to life with a soft chime, the tension coiled tighter, threading through every row, every whisper, every sideways glance. Amara sat still through it all, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze steady out the window. Below them, the world grew clearer, ribbons of highways, patches of suburban sprawl, the jagged silver lines of rivers cutting through the earth like veins. And waiting somewhere beyond that, standing tall at the arrival gate, was the man they had underestimated. Victor Bennett did not need to raise his voice to make the walls tremble. He only needed to arrive, and they were almost there. The wheels struck the runway with a low, rolling thunder, the force of it jarring through the cabin and sending a ripple of motion through every seat back and armrest. The engines roared in reverse, slowing their momentum with a deep mechanical growl as the plane decelerated, tires humming against the concrete until the world outside the windows blurred into steadiness once again. Amara sat stiffly against the window, her seatbelt already snug across her lap, her fingers clenching the armrest so tightly the ridged pattern of the vinyl pressed deep into her palms. Around her, passengers stirred restlessly, their bodies already leaning into the rhythms of disembarkation, gathering bags, stretching limbs, straightening jackets. But a thick current of tension still pulsed just beneath the surface, more palpable now, more visible in the darting glances, the quickened movements, the unspoken awareness that something was about to happen. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, smoother than it had been before, but no less clipped, offering the usual mechanical pleasantries about weather conditions, local time, and the welcome to their destination city. But there was no warmth in it, no real sense of conclusion, only the careful, practiced words of a man trying to maintain the facade for a few more minutes until the illusion shattered. Amara kept her head down as the plane taxied toward the terminal, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears it almost drowned out the announcements. She could feel the shifting energies around her, the way the attendants moved down the aisle with forced cheer, offering tight smiles and quick nods to the passengers they passed, but studiously avoiding her row. It didn't matter. She wasn't looking at them anymore. Her focus was narrowing, sharpening toward a single point she knew was waiting just beyond the airplane walls. The plane rolled to a halt at the gate, the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign turning off sparking a flurry of activity as passengers leapt to their feet, wrestling overhead compartments open and jostling for their place in the slow-moving river of bodies inching toward the front. Amara stayed seated, waiting, watching, breathing as deeply as she could manage. And then, through the narrow gap between the heads of the passengers crowding the aisle, she saw him. Victor Bennett stood just beyond the glass wall of the jet bridge, his posture as still and commanding as if he were carved from stone, a tailored navy suit fitting him like armor, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. His gaze swept the incoming passengers with a calm precision that made the flight crew fumble their movements, and the gate agents glanced nervously over their shoulders. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He simply stood there, waiting, radiating a quiet authority so heavy it seemed to warp the air around him, bending the invisible currents of the room without a single word. Amara's breath caught in her throat, a tight, aching mixture of relief and pride swelling inside her chest, until she thought she might burst from it. She wiped quickly at her face, straightened her jacket, and clutched her backpack tightly to her side. She knew now that everything was about to change. A few rows ahead, Linda Calloway chattered obliviously with her daughter, pausing only to scold a flight attendant for not retrieving her bags fast enough. She was smiling, relaxed, her face still glowing from what she clearly considered a small personal victory, unaware that the ground she stood on was about to crack wide open beneath her feet. The flight attendants moved jerkily through their final duties, collecting trash, checking seat pockets, smiling too hard at passengers they barely seemed able to see. Every few moments, one of them would glance nervously toward the front of the cabin, where the glass wall made Victor's figure impossible to ignore, a looming reminder that there would be no smooth handoff this time, no easy slipping away into the next flight. Passengers began to shuffle forward, the line creeping slowly as people reclaimed their coats and carry-ons, nudging each other gently down the narrow aisle. The closer they got to the front, the thicker the tension grew, the more faces tightened and hands fumbled with zippers and latches. Amara rose quietly from her seat when her row was called to move forward, shouldering her backpack and stepping into the slow march toward the inevitable. Her legs felt strange beneath her, stiff but certain, as if she were moving through water rather than air. But she did not falter, did not stumble. As she moved closer to the front of the plane, the rows thinned and Victor's figure sharpened in her view. Solid, unmoving. The steady point she had needed in the middle of everything that had tried to unmake her. Linda Calloway and her daughter gathered their belongings ahead of her, still laughing softly, still oblivious, still wrapped in the comfortable certainty that the world was tilted in their favor. The final few feet between Amara and the door stretched out long and slow, each step a drumbeat, each breath a quiet reminder that she was not the one who needed to hang her head. And as she crossed the threshold, stepping into the jet bridge and into the charged space where her father stood waiting, the world shifted again, not in a lurching, violent way, but in a slow, undeniable pull, like the tide returning to claim what had always been its own. Victor's eyes found hers instantly, his face softening only slightly as he reached out and gently rested a hand on her shoulder, grounding her, steadying her. "You're okay now," he said quietly. A simple statement, not a question. Amara nodded, the last of her fear sliding away under the weight of his presence, leaving only the bright, fierce core of herself shining clean and whole once again. And just behind them, still laughing, still unknowing, Linda Calloway stepped off the plane and into the reckoning that was waiting with open arms. Linda Calloway stepped off the plane with the same careless grace she had carried all flight, her hand adjusting the strap of her expensive leather purse, her daughter trailing behind her, with a tablet tucked under one arm and a glazed look of exhaustion. Linda's eyes flicked briefly over the small cluster of airline employees gathered at the gate. A gate supervisor, 2 attendants, a man in an operations jacket, but she paid them little mind, offering only the barest smile as she steered her daughter toward the terminal. She barely noticed Victor standing just a few paces away, dressed sharply in a navy suit, polished shoes planted firmly against the speckled carpet. His presence too still, too heavy to belong to a mere bystander. She registered him only as an obstacle to be stepped around, someone else's problem. Certainly not hers, until he spoke. "Mrs. Calloway," Victor said, his voice smooth and level, not loud but carrying easily through the open space, threading through the idle chatter of passengers, disembarking and slicing cleanly into the low murmur of airport noise. Linda turned automatically at the sound of her name, her expression briefly confused, then cautiously polite. She blinked at him, scanning for a name tag, some identifier of staff rank, already preparing herself to unleash a complaint about the boarding chaos or the slow baggage retrieval. Instead, she found nothing but the weight of his gaze, steady and unmoving, a mirror she was not prepared to face. "Yes?" she said, her voice sharpened slightly by habit, the instinctive demand for service stitched into every syllable. Victor stepped forward once, closing the small distance between them with measured calm. Amara stood just behind him, silent, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her chin lifted high. "My name is Victor Bennett," he said, each word delivered with quiet precision, with the certainty of a man who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. "I am the chief executive officer of this airline." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending shock waves through the small gathered crowd. Several passengers who had paused to check their phones or stretch their legs straightened slowly, their gazes snapping to attention. The gate agents stiffened, exchanging quick, panicked glances. One of the flight attendants from the plane paled visibly, her mouth opening slightly before she hastily closed it again. Linda's smile faltered, the carefully maintained polish of her social armor cracking just slightly. She opened her mouth to respond, but Victor held up one hand. Not rudely, not forcefully, but with a quiet authority that brokered no interruption. "During this flight," he continued, his voice unwavering, "you demanded that a child be removed from her assigned seat, a seat that had been lawfully purchased and reserved for her, for no reason other than your own convenience. When she defended her right to remain, you escalated the situation publicly, drawing unnecessary attention to her, humiliating her, and ultimately pressuring the cabin crew into violating both airline policy and basic human decency." Linda's face flushed deep red, her mouth working silently for a moment before she managed to find her voice. "I didn't mean," she began, her tone laced with a defensive whine that grated against the growing silence around her. Victor's hand came up again, a slight, almost imperceptible motion that nevertheless froze her words in her throat. "You made her feel unwelcome in a space she had every right to occupy," he said, his voice still calm, but harder now, a steely edge slipping beneath the measured cadence. "You leveraged the discomfort of others, the biases you assumed would protect you, to displace a 13-year-old girl traveling alone. And you did it without shame, without hesitation, and without regard for the harm you were causing." Passengers stopped walking entirely now, their eyes locked on the unfolding scene. A mother holding a toddler pressed one hand lightly to her child's head, as if shielding him from the weight of the moment. A businessman a few feet away lowered his briefcase slowly to the ground, his expression tight with something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. Linda opened her mouth again, searching desperately for something. An excuse? A denial? Anything that would allow her to reclaim the ground crumbling beneath her feet. But Victor was already moving forward, his words quiet and final. "As of this moment," he said, "your elite status with this airline is revoked. You are banned from all future flights operated by our company. Your behavior is in direct violation of our passenger conduct policies, and you will be formally notified in writing by the end of the day." Gasps rippled through the gathered bystanders. The flight attendants shifted uneasily, their postures rigid with the knowledge that this was far beyond anything they could smooth over with apologies or drink vouchers. Linda gaped at him, her hand fluttering uselessly at her chest. You can't do that," she stammered. But even as she said it, her voice cracked under the weight of the truth, because she knew he could, and he would, and nothing she said here would change that. Victor held her gaze a moment longer, letting the silence stretch just enough to make her squirm, to make her feel the full weight of what she had done. Then he turned slightly, addressing the gate agents and crew without raising his voice. "Flight Supervisor Granger and Flight Attendant Paulson are to be suspended effective immediately pending review," he said evenly. "They failed to uphold our service standards and contributed to the mistreatment of a minor passenger. Escort them from duty once all passengers have disembarked." The staff stiffened again, nodding quickly, some with faces drained of color. Victor turned back to Linda one last time, his voice lower but no less cutting. "You treated my daughter like she didn't belong," he said quietly, almost conversationally. "Now you can experience, in a very small way, what that feels like." Linda Calloway stood frozen in the gate area, her face burning, her world suddenly much smaller than she had ever imagined it could be. The terminal buzzed with low, restless energy, the kind that usually faded into the backdrop of a busy airport, but today it thickened the air like fog, making every word spoken sound sharper, every glance exchanged feel heavier. Passengers lingered near the gate, pretending to scroll through their phones or adjust their luggage, their attention magnetized by the heavy silence that hung in the air around Linda Calloway and her daughter. Victor, however, gave them no attention. His hand rested firmly on Amara's shoulder as he led her away from the crowd, his movements steady, deliberate, every step a clear message that this moment was not over, not forgotten, and certainly not forgiven. His eyes flicked once toward the small cluster of airline staff hovering near the counter, the ones who had allowed it to happen, and without raising his voice, without even speaking, he summoned them forward with the smallest tilt of his head. They followed without hesitation, falling into a quiet, uneasy procession behind him as he led them down a service corridor tucked beyond the main terminal. A glass-walled conference room waited there, cold and clinical under bright fluorescent lights, the door open like a summons none of them could refuse. Inside, Victor motioned for Amara to sit at the far end of the long table. She did so quietly, her backpack resting at her feet, her posture straight, her chin lifted with a dignity that no one here had managed to show her before. Flight Supervisor Granger entered first, her face tight, her mouth already set into a defensive line, the stiffness of her posture betraying the fear she tried so hard to hide. Behind her came Flight Attendant Paulson, younger, his face pale, his hands fidgeting nervously with the hem of his jacket, guilt heavy in every step he took. Victor remained standing. He did not sit behind the table, did not allow the formality of office chairs and meeting protocols to soften the gravity of what had happened. He stood at the head of the room, his presence filling the space completely, an immovable reminder that authority, when properly wielded, left no room for excuse. Supervisor Granger spoke first, her words tumbling out in a rush meant to control the narrative before it slipped entirely from her grasp. "Sir, I want to sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding on board," she said, her voice thin, reedy. "I made the decision to reassign the seat temporarily to de-escalate a tense situation. It was about maintaining peace in the cabin." Victor's gaze didn't waver. He let her speak, let her twist herself in her own weak justifications until she faltered under the weight of his silence. "And what," he said finally, his voice quiet but edged with steel, "was the source of that tension?" Granger blinked, thrown off by the directness of the question. "The passenger from economy," she said slowly, choosing her words with painful care, "was very upset about being separated from her daughter." And instead of addressing her inappropriate behavior, Victor said, each word deliberate, slicing neatly through her excuses, "You decided the best solution was to move a minor, my daughter, from her lawfully assigned seat, without verifying the full facts, without even checking her boarding pass. Granger opened her mouth, then closed it again, her shoulders sagging slightly. Victor turned his gaze to Paulson, who flinched but did not look away. "You were present," Victor said, his voice a shade softer now but no less firm. "You saw what was happening. Why did you not intervene?" Paulson swallowed hard, his voice shaking slightly when he answered. I tried," he said, shame coloring every word. "I hesitated. I thought Supervisor Granger had it under control. I didn't know what to do." Victor studied him for a long moment, and in that silence, the distinction became clear. Paulson had failed through weakness, not malice. His guilt was real, and though it did not erase the harm done, it separated him from the woman who had actively chosen convenience over decency. "You failed to protect her," Victor said, his voice even but unyielding. "But you will be given a chance to make it right. You will be placed on probation. You will undergo mandatory retraining. And you will spend the next 6 months assigned to our new internal passenger advocacy program, where you will learn, firsthand, what it means to stand up for what is right even when it is uncomfortable." Paulson nodded quickly, his relief obvious, though tempered by the shame he still wore like a second uniform. Victor turned back to Granger, his expression hardening again. "You," he said, "are suspended effective immediately. Your failure was not hesitation, it was willful. You sided with prejudice. You punished a child for the entitlement of another adult, and you did it with the full weight of your authority. There is no room for that here." Granger's face twisted as if she wanted to argue, to plead, to spin the narrative in some desperate last-minute bid for sympathy. But one look at Victor's face, calm, unmovable, final, silenced whatever protest might have formed. "You will surrender your identification badge and uniform before you leave this building," Victor said. "You will be escorted from the premises. Further disciplinary actions will be determined following a full review." The air in the room seemed to thin, pressing against the glass walls, making every breath feel harder than the last. Granger's shoulders sagged under the weight of it, her hands trembling as she nodded stiffly, unable to meet Victor's gaze. Without another word, Victor turned back to Amara, his expression softening only for her. He reached out, resting a warm, steady hand on her shoulder once more. "Let's go, Princess," he said, his voice gentler now, a quiet promise woven through the words. Amara rose, lifting her backpack, and together they left the room, stepping back into the terminal where the world, curious, watchful, hungry for the truth, waited just beyond the glass walls. Behind them, Supervisor Granger slumped into a chair, her future unraveling before her, while Paulson stood frozen by the door, the consequences of weakness weighing heavy on his young shoulders. And beyond the gate, the first tremors of a much larger reckoning had already begun to ripple outward. Impossible to stop now, impossible to silence. The world outside the glass-walled meeting room did not stand still to wait for the pieces to fall neatly into place. It moved as it always did, fast, relentless, impatient, and by the time Victor and Amara rejoined the main flow of the terminal, the first ripples had already started to spread. Passengers who had witnessed the confrontation were no longer content to whisper quietly among themselves. Screens glowed in every direction as video after video uploaded to social media platforms, capturing fragments of Linda Calloway's humiliation, the sharp, even voice of Victor Bennett cutting through the terminal noise, the stunned silence that had followed his calm, deliberate revelations. The first posts appeared within minutes. Blurry clips taken from phones, hastily captioned with phrases like, "Entitled passenger gets public smackdown by airline CEO," and "First-class justice served cold." Then came clearer videos, better angles, passengers tagging local news outlets, influencers amplifying the story with commentary, their followers flooding comment sections with outrage and applause. By the time Victor and Amara reached the black SUV waiting at the curb, driven by a quiet, stone-faced security officer, the story had broken wide open. Notifications exploded across Victor's phone. A steady, vibrating flood of emails, texts, and urgent requests for comment from news agencies scrambling to catch up to the narrative already unfolding without them. Victor glanced at the screen once, his jaw tightening slightly. But he made no move to answer any of the calls. He had no intention of rushing to control the story. He knew better than to chase a wildfire. The truth was already burning its own path, carving through public opinion with the same ruthless clarity he had shown at the gate. Beside him, Amara sat quietly, her backpack hugged to her chest, her face turned toward the window. She was not smiling, but there was a quiet peace in the way she held herself now, a steadiness that spoke louder than any victory dance could. She knew, even if she didn't have the words for it yet, that something important had shifted today. Not just in the way others saw her, but in the way she saw herself. Across the city, the consequences gathered speed. Linda Calloway's name trended on every major social media platform by nightfall, dragged through the mud with ruthless efficiency by a public who had seen enough entitlement, enough cruelty, to recognize it instantly. Screenshots of her professional profiles were unearthed and circulated. Her membership in exclusive clubs, her children's private school affiliations, her boutique business ventures. Calls for boycotts erupted almost instantly, petitions demanding her removal from community boards, gaining thousands of signatures within hours. The footage from the airport spread beyond social media, picked up by national news programs and morning talk shows. Panelists debated the deeper implications, the intersections of race, privilege, authority, while clips of Victor's calm, devastating confrontation played on loop beside scrolling headlines. In one particularly pointed broadcast, a legal analyst praised Victor's measured response, noting that his refusal to escalate or humiliate unnecessarily had only made the injustice more visible, more undeniable. Meanwhile, inside the headquarters of Victor's airline, change moved just as swiftly. He convened an emergency board meeting the next morning, gathering executives and department heads into the stark glass-walled conference room that overlooked the city skyline. His voice, when he spoke, was as calm and steady as it had been at the gate, but the undercurrent of resolve in every word left no room for confusion. There would be no scapegoating, no shallow gestures meant to placate public outrage. They would tear out the roots of the culture that had allowed this to happen and build something stronger in its place. Mandatory anti-discrimination training was ordered across every level of operations, from ground staff to executives. A new policy was announced. No minor, no matter their background, could be displaced from their assigned seat under any circumstances without direct executive approval. A passenger conduct enforcement division was established, reporting directly to Victor's office, empowered to act swiftly and decisively against any future incidents of bias or discrimination. And most importantly, a new initiative was announced, the Amara Bennett Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to protect and elevate young travelers, ensuring dignity, respect, and support for every child who boarded one of their planes, no matter who they were or where they sat. Victor insisted that Amara's name be attached publicly, not as a symbol of victimhood, but as a beacon of strength, a reminder that change did not come from anger alone, but from standing firm in the face of it. He did not ask for approval. He did not wait for consensus. He moved with the certainty of a man who had seen the cost of hesitation and refused to pay it again. As the news spread, as the reforms took shape, as Linda Calloway's world shrank smaller and smaller with each passing day, Amara's grew in quiet, steady ways she could not yet see, but would one day understand. She had been knocked down by a system designed to pretend it was neutral while punishing those who dared to stand out. And she had risen, not with rage, but with dignity, with the quiet, unshakable belief that she deserved her place. Not because someone granted it to her, but because it had been hers all along. And now, finally, the world was learning to see it too. The days that followed unfolded with a kind of slow, heavy inevitability, as if the entire world had shifted on its axis, and now gravity pulled a little harder on those who had once moved through it unchecked. For Linda Calloway, the collapse began quietly, almost invisibly at first. A sudden string of missed calls from business associates, polite emails returned with terse apologies, the invitations to luncheons and galas that had once peppered her calendar drying up overnight. At first, she tried to brush it off, to convince herself that the noise would pass, that the story would fade into the endless churn of daily outrage like so many others before it. But the noise only grew louder. Clips of her confrontation continued to circulate online, paired with hashtags that dragged her name through every corner of the internet. The smile she had worn so confidently while displacing a child was frozen forever now, replayed in slow motion, dissected by strangers who no longer saw a woman deserving of sympathy, but a symbol of something much larger and uglier. Public petitions demanding her removal from various organizations gained traction, gathering tens of thousands of signatures in days. Her daughter, Chloe, became a reluctant casualty in the firestorm. Parents at her school whispered behind cupped hands. Classmates stared in the hallways, some with curiosity, others with open disdain. The principal, once a friendly ally at board meetings, sent a polite but firm letter suggesting that it might be in the best interests of all involved if Chloe completed the semester elsewhere. Linda's boutique consultancy business faltered, then crumbled entirely, as clients quietly canceled contracts and severed ties, citing reputational concerns too delicate to spell out directly. Banks, insurance agents, country clubs, the invisible network that had once propped her up, withdrew their favors one by one, leaving her scrambling, bewildered, watching helplessly as the foundation she had built her identity upon cracked wide open beneath her feet. And through it all, no apology came. Not because she was too proud, though she was, but because, deep down, Linda Calloway still believed she had been right, still believed that the world owed her a place at the front, that her comfort mattered more than a stranger's dignity. It was that belief, stubborn and unrepentant, that turned her fall from grace into something inevitable and complete. Meanwhile, inside the airline's towering headquarters, the reckoning for Supervisor Granger took a different, but no less final shape. The internal investigation moved swiftly, the facts stacking up with brutal clarity. Recorded statements from passengers, internal crew reports, security footage from the boarding area, all pointed to the same conclusion. Granger had not simply mishandled a tense situation. She had exercised her authority in a way that directly violated company policy and federal guidelines protecting unaccompanied minors. Worse, she had done so without even the barest attempt at due diligence, prioritizing her own ease over a child's right to be treated with fairness and respect. When the findings were presented to Victor, he reviewed them without anger, without satisfaction, only the same cold, steady commitment he had shown from the beginning. Granger was terminated with cause, her dismissal finalized less than a week after the incident. There would be no severance package, no quiet reassignment to another department, no carefully worded resignation letter allowing her to save face. Her departure was public, final, and absolute, a signal to every employee that the new standards were not suggestions, but demands, and that the company's promises to protect its passengers would not be sacrificed for convenience or cowardice. For Flight Attendant Paulson, the outcome was different, shaped by the careful distinctions Victor had drawn that day in the conference room. His probation began immediately, his retraining assignments rigorous and demanding, designed to strip away any lingering fear of confrontation when injustice unfolded before him. 6 months of shadowing passenger advocacy teams, 6 months of reporting directly to internal oversight officers. 6 months of learning that silence in the face of wrongdoing was not neutrality. It was complicity. It was not a punishment. Not truly. It was a chance to rebuild from the failure, to prove that he understood now what he had been too timid to grasp, in the moment when it had mattered most. And as these private reckonings unfolded behind closed doors, the public face of the airline continued to change as well. The Amara Bennett initiative launched formally with a press conference broadcast live across major networks. Victor stood at the podium, Amara by his side, her posture straight, her chin high, her presence quiet but commanding. He spoke simply, without grandstanding, about the company's failures, about the culture that had allowed them, and about the responsibility they now bore to do better. He named the mistakes. He promised action. And he delivered it, step by step, policy by policy, brick by brick. No more apologies without change. No more tolerance for the quiet, insidious biases that so often went unnamed but left scars all the same. And as the cameras clicked and the reporters scribbled notes, Amara stood there, not as a victim, not as a prop, but as a living reminder that justice was not about vengeance or spectacle. It was about truth made visible, about dignity restored, about making sure the next little girl who boarded a flight alone would never again be made to feel like a mistake in a place she had every right to be. The story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told in 100 silent ways that they did not belong. And it was only just beginning. The weight of it all finally broke through on a rainy Thursday morning, a week after the confrontation that had reshaped more than just a single flight's passenger list. Linda Calloway sat stiffly in the back of a nondescript sedan, her lawyer tapping quietly at his tablet beside her, the silence between them brittle and full of unspoken defeat. She stared blankly out the window at the city rolling past in muted colors, the rain tracing crooked paths down the glass, blurring the once familiar skyline into something foreign and distant. She was on her way to yet another closed-door meeting, another attempt to salvage what was left of the life she had once moved through so easily. But the outcome was already written in the strained expressions and tight, forced politeness of those few business partners still willing to meet with her. No one wanted to be seen standing beside her anymore. No one wanted to carry the weight of association with a name now synonymous with privilege, entitlement, and public shame. The organizations she had championed for years had quietly cut ties, some issuing public statements condemning discrimination in all forms, others simply letting her name vanish from their websites without ceremony or explanation. Her daughter's new school accepted her grudgingly, but Chloe moved through its halls like a ghost, a girl carrying a last name that cracked open every room she entered. No lawsuit Linda's lawyer could draft, no spin from the crisis management firm she had hired at great expense, could undo the simple, brutal power of the truth. The world had seen her, had judged her, and had found her wanting. And far from fading, the story had only deepened. A second wave of coverage had begun, not fueled by anger now, but by analysis, by quiet, pointed conversations about the structures that allowed such moments to happen in the first place. Victor's reforms had become a national model for corporate responsibility, lauded not only for their breadth, but for their speed, a rare and powerful admission that saying the right things was never enough without action to back them. Journalists, civil rights leaders, education advocates, they all spoke Amara's name now with reverence, not because she had shouted or fought or demanded the spotlight, but because she had endured with dignity when it would have been so much easier to collapse. And Linda could not run from that. She could not buy her way out of it. She could not explain it away. It was fixed now, a part of her story, a scar carved deep into her reputation, visible to anyone who cared to look. At the same time, inside the headquarters of Victor's airline, the final stages of transformation were falling into place. The Passenger Advocacy Division was already operational, staffed with a team drawn not from corporate lifers, but from a diverse pool of candidates, former educators, community organizers, youth counselors, people who understood that respect was not a policy, but a daily practice. Reports of minor discrimination incidents dropped sharply within the first month, not because the incidents disappeared overnight, but because passengers and staff alike now understood that there were real, immediate consequences for actions once brushed off as misunderstandings or isolated mistakes. Flight crews underwent immersive training sessions, built not around empty slogans, but around role-playing difficult scenarios, learning not just how to avoid mistakes, but how to stand firmly in the moment when it mattered most. And Amara, though shielded from the worst of the media glare, began to find her footing in the new reality, shaped partly by her own quiet courage. Her days returned to something close to normal, but they were different too. Not because she sought attention, but because the respect she encountered now was genuine, hard-earned. Teachers who had once overlooked her in the classroom now listened more carefully when she spoke. Strangers who recognized her name offered smiles, not stares. She carried herself differently too, a little taller, a little more certain. The memory of what she had survived tucked into the spaces between her ribs like a second spine. One afternoon, sitting at the dining room table with her father, Amara found herself staring at a copy of the official letter the airline had sent, announcing the launch of the Amara Bennett Initiative. Her name, printed in clean, strong type, looked different than it did in school awards or on birthday cards. It looked permanent. It looked deserved. Victor watched her quietly, letting her absorb the weight of it in her own time, his presence steady and sure beside her. "You changed things," he said finally, his voice low and proud. "You didn't let them define you. You made them see you for who you are." Amara swallowed past the sudden lump in her throat, her fingers brushing lightly over the paper as if committing the feeling of it to memory. "I just wanted it to stop," she said softly. Victor smiled, a small, knowing thing. "Sometimes," he said, "that's how real change starts." Outside, the rain eased into a light drizzle, the last heavy clouds breaking apart to reveal thin, hesitant shafts of sunlight. Inside, something heavier lifted too, not forgotten, not erased, but carried now with strength rather than sorrow. Amara folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her backpack next to the worn, creased note her father had given her the day she boarded that flight, a reminder that she had always belonged wherever she chose to stand. And this time, when she smiled, it wasn't because she had won something she wasn't sure she deserved. It was because she had never needed anyone else's permission to claim it in the first place. The invitation came 2 weeks later, delivered by courier to Victor's office in a slim navy envelope stamped with the seal of the National Civil Rights Council. Inside, a letter, formal, crisp, and filled with a kind of reverence that no amount of media spin could manufacture, invited Victor and Amara to the annual Leadership and Justice Awards ceremony, where Amara would be honored with the Rising Voice Award for her quiet, courageous stand against discrimination. Victor had read the letter twice before calling Amara into his office, holding it out to her with a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She had taken it cautiously at first, her fingers running over the heavy paper, her eyes scanning the words slowly, carefully, as if she didn't quite trust that they were meant for her. When she finished, she looked up at him, her mouth opening slightly in astonishment. "They want me?" she said, the disbelief clear in her voice. But beneath it, the first flicker of pride blooming into something stronger, something she had earned through fire and endurance. "They want you," Victor said simply, "because you showed them what real courage looks like." The night of the ceremony, the ballroom glittered with polished silverware and low golden lighting, the air filled with the quiet hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, the rustle of fine fabrics. Leaders, activists, educators, and artists moved through the space, all gathered to celebrate those who had carried forward the long, unfinished work of justice. Amara stood near the entrance with Victor, her dress simple but elegant, her hair pulled back neatly, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. She watched the crowd with wide, steady eyes, feeling the pulse of the evening not as something overwhelming, but as something she had a right to stand within, to claim as part of her story. When her name was called, there was no roar of applause, no thunderous standing ovation, not because they did not honor her, but because the moment itself demanded something quieter, something deeper. A kind of collective breath held in reverence as she crossed the room, climbed the short set of steps to the stage, and stood at the podium, her small hands resting lightly on its polished surface. She looked out across the sea of faces, strangers, leaders, legends, and for a moment, the weight of it all pressed against her. The memory of that first flight, of the fear, the humiliation, the terrible loneliness she had felt. But then she remembered her father's hand on her shoulder. She remembered the letter tucked safely in her backpack. She remembered the way the truth had burned through the lies, the way her own dignity had refused to bend, even when everything else had tried to break it. And so, when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I didn't ask for what happened to me," she said, her words clear and measured, carrying easily through the quiet room. "I didn't expect to be standing here. I just wanted to be seen, to be treated with respect, like anyone else. But I learned that sometimes, when you are forced to stand alone, you find out how strong you really are. And when people stand with you, when people refuse to look away, that strength grows." She paused, letting the words settle. "I didn't change the world," she continued, her smile small but real, "but maybe I helped remind it how to see." There was a long, aching moment of stillness, and then the applause rose, not wild, not frantic, but sure and steady. A tide that lifted through the room and wrapped around her like a promise. Victor rose to his feet, his hands coming together slowly, proudly, his heart too full for words. Around him, others followed, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that here stood a young girl who had borne something heavy and transformed it into something beautiful. When Amara stepped down from the stage, Victor was waiting at the bottom of the steps, his arms open. She went to him without hesitation, the pride radiating from both of them, quiet but unbreakable. That night, as they drove home under the soft wash of city lights, Amara leaned her head lightly against the window, the award resting in her lap, her father's hand resting warmly on her shoulder. She knew the road ahead would not always be smooth. She knew there would be other battles, other moments where the world would demand that she prove herself again. But she also knew, deep in her bones, that she had already crossed the hardest part. Not because she had defeated anyone, but because she had refused to be defeated by them. And that would never change. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.